Think about Descartes, think about Spinoza, think about Kant. The whole idealist or rationalist tradition tends to emphasize inwardness, internality. And perhaps that's the most, not only an important characteristic of Husserl, but I would be inclined to say that that's one of the most characteristic moves, the characteristic intellectual deployments of continental philosophy. In other words, unlike the Anglo-American tradition, which looks outward like Hume, and develops a theory of the external world, and then afterwards, as a sort of postscript to that activity, develops a theory of the psyche, of the mind, of what's internal to a human being. Well, the continental tradition does the opposite. They start out with a theory of what's inside, and then from there they try and work outwards. And both the Anglo-American tradition and the continental tradition suffer from a sort of common problem. When they try and make the jump from one realm, what we might call the exocosm, to the internal realm, the psyche, the soul, or the mind, or what we might call the introcosm, there's always a problem in leaping that hurdle. And it doesn't really matter which side you start on. The problem is always going to be the same. How do we move from one part of the hurdle to the other? How do we move from the beginning to the end? So when you look at Husserl, when you look at this Cartesian continental tradition, keep that in mind. They're starting out with the internal facts of human consciousness and generating the world from that. Okay? So it's a different problematic, a different starting point, and that's what you keep in mind when you look at Husserl. Now, corresponding to this way of developing a philosophy is the hope of getting certain knowledge, like Descartes. Descartes' whole project of radical skepticism was to develop a knowledge that was foundational and completely certain. Husserl is trying to do the same thing. He's a sort of neo-Cartesian. And much of his work, when you actually start to read the stuff that he's published, because although he produced a tremendous amount of writing, most of what he produced was not published in his lifetime. And he was in a voluminous writer. He produced almost 45,000 pages of work. And it tends to be very repetitive. It is methodological for the most part, and particularly programmatic. In other words, what his writings are about is how we engage in a method, which he calls phenomenology, which will allow us to discern these eternal essences that exist within the human psyche.